Good evening. I haven't said that in a while. What's the point of school? If you're like me a few years ago, you would probably say nothing. That might not be a fair treatment of the topic. If you were like me nowadays, you would probably still say nothing, and that still might not be a fair treatment because at the end of the day, we all know what school's about, don't we? Whether it's kids school, maybe it's college or a technical school, or even something like an internship or apprenticeship program. What's the point of all of those things? The point is, spoiler alert, that you get a little bit of learning in you, and then you're able to do something with that learning and turn it around and make it useful. If you're in a grade school, you turn it around and take tests so that you can achieve something, so that you can go to college and take more tests and get a degree that certifies you to work in a certain area. If you're in an internship, then maybe you practice doing things a few times and then you get slightly better. Hopefully, that's the goal. And at the end of it, you turn out to be more prepared for entering the actual workforce. We all know what learning is. We all know what school is for. It's so that you get something in your head so that you can do something with it. Shouldn't be a surprise. And so when I tell you that the book of Ephesians works the same way, I hope that doesn't shock you in any way. The point of learning things in church is, after all, to turn around and do something with it, isn't it? The point of storing up all this information isn't just so that I get smarter than everybody else. It's so that I turn around and use it to better my life and to better your lives and help other people better theirs. And so when we look at the book of Ephesians, you've got 3 chapters of a theory of learning about God, of seeing these things that God has done, of getting insight into who God is and what his plans are. But the point isn't just so that we can focus on knowing all these things about God. The point is so that we turn around and actually use it for a greater goal. What's the point of knowing about God? Maybe we should be united with God. Maybe we need to work towards that. Maybe we need to bring other people in so that they can know God too. We've reached the point of the book where we take the theory that we've been learning the past few months and we start to turn it around and practice it and start to actually apply it and use it for something. You know the grandness of what God's done? You know the picture? You know where the church sits in the universe? You know how that's a display for his power? Now do something with that. And as such, and as Paul dives into this practical section, I was planning on covering the first half of this chapter. And as I was going through sermon preparation, I made the executive decision to cut the sermon in half because there's just too much to cover. I was planning on doing the first 16 verses. I'm actually going to do the first 6 verses tonight, and in 2 weeks, Lord willing, when I'm up here again, we'll have a part 2, and it'll cover the rest of the other verses of the section, because it all is one section. It goes along with the theme of the song, We Are One, just perfectly. And this week, we're going to talk about being unified. We're going to talk about the oneness part of it, and next week, we'll talk about the service part of it. What we have to ask here as we enter Ephesians 4 is what exactly does it take to enact that work that God has given us to do? That's what Paul focuses on. As you start into Ephesians 4, back up, let's start reading at the end of chapter 3, and we'll read the first few verses, down through the first few verses of chapter 4. Chapter 3 and verse 20, this is the end of Paul's excellent prayer. As he's praising God for who he is, he says this: Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus for all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Therefore, based on all those things, therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, in all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, being diligent to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you are also called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Why does Paul start there? Why does Paul start his practical section by talking about unity? Why? because unity determines the effectiveness of a local church. And so he turns this around. It's not just about God, it's not just about the church in the cosmos. He turns it to Ephesus and says, it's about you guys. How are you going to accomplish the work that God has for you to do? And so Paul opens the section. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord. He introduces himself again in verse 1, curiously. Like he would do at the beginning of the epistle, it's kind of a restart because he's starting into this brand new section because of all these things that God's done, because of all of the blessings that God has given, because of who God is. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, both a prisoner to do everything that Christ says and the prisoner for the sake of Christ, I urge you, that's a strong word there. I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. What is that calling? The call of God, what has the call of God been for the past 3 chapters? It's been to be saved. It's been to get united with Him. It's been to get in the church, the group of the saved people. And as such, Paul says, you're going to be working together with a group of people. You're going to need some ways in which to accomplish that. If you want to walk worthy of the calling of God, to be one of the saved people, if you want to walk worthy of being in the church and working for God and being part of His body, you're going to need to get unified with everybody else. And that's going to take some specific character qualities. We might call them graces that you're going to need to cultivate in your life so that you can actually get unified with people so that you can begin to accomplish the work of God. Now, no good sermon on Ephesians 4 and on the unity of the church. No good sermon is going to be complete without a definition for the word unity and a distinction between some other things that people usually misconstrue. As in, you've probably heard a distinction between unity and uniformity, haven't you? Is that a familiar term? Unity is the idea that we're working with other people towards the same goal. Whereas uniformity, it sounds pretty similar in its word and even in its definition. What is the definition? It's doing the same thing as everybody else. And you look at those two on paper, well, it kind of looks the same, kind of equivalent. But then you start thinking about it and you realize they're actually very different. Unity is working towards a goal, it's targeting the goal. Uniformity is targeting the means, not the end. And so, actually, what you have is a distinction between working towards something and everybody just copying each other's homework, as it were. Unity forms from an inward kind of peace. Unity forms from a realization that we're all working towards God together, and we're all going to do it in slightly different ways. And I'm going to be up here preaching, and you're going to be down there listening. And sometimes some of you will be preaching, and I will be listening. And you know what? That's fine, because we're all working towards the same goal at the end of the day. Uniformity is all 40-something of us getting up here and preaching a paragraph. And that doesn't work very well. God does not want everybody to do the exact same thing. You'll see examples down in verse 11 when he gives people different gifts. You'll see an example down in verse 16 as Paul describes the church as a body made up of different parts working together towards the same whole. God wants unity working together. And you know what that takes? First thing Paul says it takes is it's going to take some humility. Verse 2, all 5 of these ideas that I'm bringing out are going to be straight from verse 2. Paul says, firstly, you want to walk in a manner worthy of the calling. You want to be unified. Firstly, you need to start by being humble. What is humility? Humility is the honoring of others before yourself, essentially. If you want to get along with people, the first place you're going to have to start is by respecting that they're a little different than you. If I want to accomplish something with somebody else, I need to realize they're not the same as me. They don't communicate the same as I do. They won't do the same things that I will. They won't think in the same way that I think. And that's okay. And we can work together on that. When I pridefully demand that my way is the only way and that everybody has to conform to what I want, things start breaking down. And that system doesn't really work. So the first thing Paul calls us to is humility and honoring other people before yourself. The second thing he calls us to is gentleness, by the way. Gentleness is the proper control and application of one's strength. Some people misconstrue this idea to be gentleness is the call for us to be weak. That's not true at all. Gentleness is not weakness or wimpiness, as we might think of it. Gentleness is strength that is applied properly. Strength under control is the general definition. And specifically, it means that you need to be strong and apply that towards the right purpose. What is that? It's applying it for other people's benefit, not your own. Too many people, when they get strength, physical, mental, whatever kind of strength, they use that to hurt other people, or they use that to benefit themselves. But strength that God has given us is not to be used to hurt others nor bring myself glory. My strength is supposed to be properly applied to bring other people strength as well. That's what gentleness is. Working, using your talents and abilities to build people up instead of destroy them. You need to be humble. You need to be gentle. What else do you need to be? Well, you need to be patient. The personal realization and willingness to hold off your wrath from other people. It's really easy for me personally. I'm slightly opinionated. I don't know if anyone's realized that before. It's really easy for me to run into a situation where I have an idea and someone else has an idea, and my idea is right. Sorry. And if you disagree with me, you're just kind of wrong. And I'm going to ignore what you say and I'm just going to do my own thing because that's how I normally operate. Patience is the opposite of that. It's not something that I'm very good at, I think you'll find. Patience is the willingness to hold off your wrath and your judgment and to give somebody else a fair hearing. It's a personal quality that helps us to understand other people. Not that we see someone doing evil and we say, oh, I'm going to be patient with that and just move on. No, not like that. But rather seeing different people serve God in different ways, ways that I would not think of. I'm going to be okay with that. I'm going to work to be patient with that, even if it doesn't make sense from my point of view. Well, I'm not all there is. I'm not the judge, now am I? And with that, you would have forbearance. The idea of tolerating one another in verse 2. Again, that's a mutual understanding between a group of people that we are going to be gentle with how we judge, shall we say. If someone sins in your midst, of course, there are ways to deal with that. God doesn't say ignore that. God says address it. If someone's sinning or if someone's just stagnating and not growing towards the Lord, you have to deal with those things. We're not talking about equivocating on that and leaving those things alone. What we are talking about is being patient with each other. What we are talking about is passing on our differences and agreeing that we can all serve God in slightly different ways because our goal is the same, even if our means are not. The only way a group can work together is by realizing that I have one job and I have some talents that I do well, and you have a different one, and you have talents that you use well, and we complement each other. And so be patient, and so forbear. And to wrap it all up, Paul gives the final binding agent that makes it all possible: love. Love is, most people say, the most important of the virtues or the qualities you can have. And yeah, that's pretty much true. When Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, what is it? It is to love. To love God, firstly, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. A lot of people have definitions for love. Love's definition, most people will quote 1 Corinthians 13. It's patient, it's kind, and so you run across these same ideas there. My personal favorite definition doesn't actually come from 1 Corinthians 13. I think it comes from Catholicism, which is curious, and I wouldn't usually think to look there. But I hear this idea associated with Catholicism a lot, that love is to seek the other person's highest good. What does that mean? It means a person's highest good, what's the best thing for them, is to get connected with God. And that means that sometimes you're kind and nice, and sometimes you're gentle and encouraging, and you're pushing them towards God. And sometimes you rebuke, and sometimes you discipline, and sometimes you correct, because that also can be used to push someone towards God. Love is the thing that makes it all possible. Love is the thing that motivates us. It's what motivated God and Jesus, and by extension, his people operate off of it too. It's the final quality. It seals the deal. It brings it all together. This is how you work with other people. Do you notice all these focuses that we have? All the different graces that you're supposed to accumulate if you want to be properly unified? You know what they all have in common? None of them are about you. They're all about helping other people. In fact, if you don't have these, well, we would say that unity is impossible. If you fail to look out for other people, if you pridefully approach situations thinking you're always right, if you harshly rebuke people instead of being gentle with them, if you're not patient with their challenges, if you don't forbear with their issues, if you're not loving in how you approach them, will you work together with others? No. There's no way that happens. That's an impossibility. And so Paul says, accumulate these things. This is called walking worthy of the calling. He ends the section in verse 3. He caps it all off with this idea, this summation statement, the conclusion, if you will, that you're supposed to be diligent to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. These two things, I guess you could slot them in the list if you want to. Being diligent to keep the unity, to keep the peace. What is God looking for? You know what God's not looking for? God's not looking for a bunch of people who get together and constantly bicker and tear each other down and backbite and fight, and there's a ton of squabbling, so much so that you can't get anything done. What God is looking for is a group of people who will make unity the consistent goal. A group of people who will consistently strive to attain and maintain unity, because any growth that you do is going to be built off of the unity that you have together. And so, don't do things to stir up trouble just because. Don't do things to push each other away. Instead, work towards each other. In Romans, an epistle that is, in my opinion, likely written to a Jewish church and a Gentile church who aren't really getting along. That seems to be the perspective Romans is written to. Paul addresses that issue. Romans 14, right? It's the basic passage that we quote in these situations. If you're doing something that antagonizes a fellow Christian, maybe don't. And maybe back off of that, because that's not going to help you to work together. God has promised all sorts of blessings. God has promised even a people. God has promised a family to us. But we have to work at it. If we're not willing to pursue the things that make for peace, if we're not willing to pursue the things that unify us, then are we really going to benefit from God's blessings? Are we really following God if we're not obeying the things he says? And so the question you have to ask from this, the question when you consider this idea of unity, is not just are we at peace, but the question, are we diligently seeking unity among ourselves? I've been part of 5 churches growing up, 2 in Kentucky, 1 in Florida. I did an internship in Indiana, and now I'm here. And of those 5 churches, 2 of them have split while I'm there. 2 of them have run into a large issue that broke the church apart, and you have various groups leaving. But I thought everything was going good. But I thought we were at peace. There weren't obvious problems. There weren't obvious issues. Well, what was going on? Well, I don't think we were genuinely, diligently pursuing peace and unity. We were glad for the situation, but we weren't actually pursuing something. Many churches you'll find split due to factions that form within them. When you look into Ephesians itself, go back to chapter 2, what's the issue? It's Jew versus Gentile, right? Over the whole New Testament, it's that issue that these 2 groups bicker and fight against each other. The half of the New Testament practically is written to get those people working together. That's the issue they run into. For us, it's not Jew versus Gentile. So what is it? Republican versus Democrat? Dare I mention that? Are those forbidden words in here? I don't know that that's a problem here, but it's something to think about. I've seen churches where people only talk to other people who share their political viewpoints. That's not really unified. That draws a dividing line over something that is, in the grand scheme of things, unimportant. I've seen people who only talk to other people who share their same hobbies. And so I'll talk to these few people because we have common interests, but the rest, I don't really need to know them. I don't need to work with them. Is that unity? Is it unified to talk to people you've only spoken to before? To never talk to any new members in the church? Is it unified to only talk to people that sit in your local section in the auditorium? Did you know there are people across the way? And sometimes we just don't get to the other sections. Do you know each other? Because you're supposed to be working together. Do you only talk to people in your age group? Do you only talk to your peers? Do you ever go outside of that? The old talking to the young and the young talking to the old? Do we realize what it takes to be unified? Again, I don't know how much of an active issue this is, but I would rather it not become one. And so I'm going to address it. Unfortunately, without thinking about it, too often we draw these lines of division instead of drawing near to everyone. We fail the command to be diligent, to keep the unity of the Spirit. And instead, we're grateful when times are easy and we're not pressured on those situations. Paul is calling us, even in times of peace, even in times when there's no external pressure pushing on us, Paul is calling us to unify when the times are simple because hard times are coming. And it's going to be a lot easier if you guys get along with each other. And so use the easy times to draw nearer to everyone. And that will be of great benefit to you when the times end up being difficult. That's the active pursuit of unity. That's the idea of being diligent to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. But too often we run into this situation, right? We're unified with people. We're getting along, generally getting along with everyone. And so we have to ask that question, is it real? Am I actually getting along with everyone? Or is it just kind of wishful thinking? Is there actually a reason we're together and we're working on this? Or am I just imagining these things and hoping that it's true? And I think that's why Paul puts in some of the foundation and the basis and the grounds, if you will, for unity itself. When you get to verses 4-6, it's not just a cool theological moment. Paul actually provides the groundwork for the unity that we are supposed to have. 7 reasons overall. 3 reasons are God himself, Father, Son, and Spirit, although in reverse order. 4 of the reasons are our responses to God. And Paul names this because God himself and God's word and God's work that he has done, that's been detailed in the previous 3 chapters, those are the basis on which we get together. It's not because I wanted to. It's not because we all share a common interest. It's because God has laid a foundation and we've all agreed to stick to it. What is God's foundation? How does God draw all these people together? Well, firstly, he has one body. We've talked about how important the church is, how it's important that we're all part of the same system. We're all working towards the same goal. God has one family. There is one way to be his. What does that imply? Firstly, it gives us an opportunity for unity with anyone in the body, but it also implies that, unfortunately, there will be many people who are not part of the body. A common theory that runs through the Christian or just the world today is that you can worship how you want to, and I can worship how I want to, and we're both right because all roads lead to God in the end and everything's fine. God does not share that opinion. Sorry. I don't know how else to say that. The question is not which version of God are you worshiping. The question is, are you in the body of God or are you not in the body of God? Because there is one body. It's a yes or no question. And if you're in his body, you're in. And if you're not conforming to his ideas, you're out. And it's a very simple question. We can be unified on that we're all brought together in one body. We can be unified because there is only one Spirit. Isn't he really the cause of the body itself? You notice that when people get baptized, they get baptized for salvation. You go back to the classic Acts 2, verse 38. It's for salvation, but it puts them into the church. And they get the gift of the Holy Spirit. That's a part of these things. The Spirit is what helps connect us to God. Without the Spirit connecting us to God, there isn't a body. But the fact is, there is only one Spirit. In God's work, He has sent the Spirit, and the Spirit's job is to gather all sorts of people. And how does the Spirit do it? Well, He records the Word and many other things that I can't name all of them. But primarily, He writes down the Word. He inspires different men to work, to put these things together, to record them for us so that we can then use them. There is one Spirit. There are not multiple words of God. There are not a bunch of different variations of the Bible, and all of them are just kind of correct. No, we are called to look to the Spirit. We are called to see His work as authoritative. If we don't listen to the Spirit's, to God's standard, how are we going to attain to the call of God? There is one Spirit. There are not a bunch of different messages. There are not a bunch of different ways to God. No, either you're listening to the Spirit or you're not, in or out. We can be unified on that. There's one hope of your calling, the calling of God. God's call goes out through the Spirit, and it gathers us and it pulls us together to be His people. We have a hope that if we follow God's call, God will end up being faithful to us. That's what He's promised. And that's the hope that we maintain. And the cool thing about this hope, it's not like any other hope that you have, because this is a hope that applies both here on earth and after in heaven. That's how it works. It's not limited to one or the other. There are a lot of people in this world who have earthly hopes and nothing beyond. But earthly hopes disappoint often, and even when they don't disappoint, they fade, and then even when you achieve something, it's not as fulfilling as you want it to be. And a few minutes later, the rush is gone, and then you're on hoping to the next thing. It never lasts. It never really works. Earthly hope is a disappointment. Hope that is only in a future goodness, hope that is only in the future, is never attainable. It isn't immediate. There's nothing to grasp onto, and so many people have that hope in heaven, see no evidence, and then leave. But people who hope in God have the best of both. We have a hope in heaven that God will one day save us and bring us to be with Him. But every blessing we get along the way on earth is a sign of greater things to come. God's hope is not merely on earth. It's not merely in heaven. It is both. And that's what drives us through life, because it brings us along in the day-to-day, and it points us to something much better even after we're dead and gone. God's the one who provides the motivational fuel to keep going. Without it, life is kind of void and worthless. But when you're with God's hope, you know you'll reach Him one day. And every day that you live and every good thing that happens to you is a promise of good things to come and a continuance of your salvation. We can be united in that. We can be united in the fact that there's one Lord, this being Jesus, the one who set up the church in the first place, because without Jesus and His sacrifice, there wouldn't be a way to reach God. Without Jesus' sacrifice, there wouldn't be a church. There wouldn't be a group of saved people. In fact, one might go so far as to say, without Jesus' sacrifice, there wouldn't be any saved people. Do you realize that? Without the work that Jesus did, without God's plan of incorporating Jesus, there's nothing. Maybe there's the Old Testament, but the point of the Old Testament is to point us towards Jesus, isn't it? If Jesus wasn't there, if God never wanted to send Jesus, if there was no promised salvation, then there would be nothing and we would be alone forever. The reason Jesus is called the Lord, the reason that He's called the Master, the reason we're His disciples or followers, or if you want to think about it like that, we're His slaves, the reason we use that kind of language is because without the work of Jesus, we wouldn't have access to anything about God. It's Jesus' work that connects us. It's Jesus' work that brings us together. And because Jesus opened the way to God, He's the one who gets to tell us how to use it. The claim in John 14 and verse 6, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Not me, but Jesus. You understand that. That claim is not a prideful claim. That claim is not just Jesus lording it over everybody else. That claim is a simple statement of fact that if you want access to God, Jesus is the one who provides access, and you have to listen to Him. There's there's not another way. There's only one faith. Who is it that we all believe in? We all believe in the same person and the same God. We all believe in the same scripture. There's a reason Christians are called Christians, because it comes from the person of Christ. Our faith stems from him. He is the core of it. He established the route to God. He is our connection point. Without faith in Jesus, what do you have? You're kind of missing everything if you don't have faith in him. If he is the way, that's what he claims. If he is the truth, that's what he says. How are there alternate ways? Is there any other way to get a connection to God? No. And that's why we describe Jesus as the core of our faith. That's why Jesus is described even earlier in Ephesians as the cornerstone that everything else is built on. There is unity in that, in who we believe, because he's the core of the system that it's all built on. There is one faith. And interestingly enough, there's one baptism too. This is an odd one thrown in the list. I'm not exactly sure why it's there. Only have to ask, what is it that we're actually baptized into? That might be Christ's death. Paul talks about that in Romans 6. You can look at especially verses 3 through 5. You're baptized into his death and thus into his resurrection. And so Christ is again at the heart of this. But I think the reason this is here is to impress upon us the point that it is not just faith that Paul is calling us to. It is not just a mental assent of God's superiority. It's not just belief, but instead it is action. Over and over again, the New Testament makes the point that faith has to be active. Faith has to be obedient. Faith has to respond and do something. It's not just a passive belief. And so we're all baptized for that same reason, because God told us to be. Many people, nitpick that. Baptism's not that important. Baptism doesn't save you, and they have questions with this. God said it did. And if God picked the point, then I can't argue it. I may not understand it. I may not be able to make a perfect case for it. I may not be able to satisfy your curiosity as to why he commanded that. But Peter said that baptism saves you. I can't argue with that. And so, is God in charge or not? He's laid the law. He's the one who tells us the baptism. Are we to ignore what he gives us to do? Do we expect his blessing if we do? Are we in or are we out? It's a basis for unity. Ultimately, the list is summed up by saying one God and Father of all, or of you all, who is in you, who is over you all, in you all, and through you all. Summation of the whole section, just glorifying God the Father who did it. You notice he's given the tag Father again. He's establishing a family. He sought out a family. That's what the church is. That's what the saved people are, is the family, the children of God. God is the one who's working through Jesus and the Spirit to establish that path. God is the one directing things. And the question is, are we following him? It's pretty clear. We shouldn't try to go outside of the plan. We shouldn't try and do our own things. These things bring us together. If we go outside of it, we're just splintering and leaving the truth of God. And so you take a step back and you look at all these things that he's labeling. One body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father. You look at all those things and you notice the commonality is just one. There is one of them. This is unity. Either you're all getting together in these ideas or you're not. It isn't that I select 6 of them and then ignore one. It isn't that I take a few and they're solid and then the rest are kind of, I can pass on them. No, it's either all or nothing. Are you together in this or not? What it shows you is that God has laid out ultimately one path for us to follow. If you want God's blessings, you have to get in his way of doing things. If you want the blessings that come from being part of God's family, you have to get in the family. There's a step. There's a guidance process here. Many people think there are multiple ways to pursue God. God does not think so. That's not me saying it, it's him. Are we in the one body? Are we not? Do we believe in the one Spirit or do we not? There's a simple test for us to get unified. And as much as we believe these things and agree on these things, we stand together. Unfortunately, what you have in this world today, when you look outside at the world, at the state of the world at large, you have many people who pursue the blessings of God and the goodness of God, but they do so without his truth or without a full understanding and appreciation of his truth. And so, whether you're looking at other religions who forget the truth of who God is and have slightly different versions or maybe very different versions of who God is, or you look among the Christian world today and you see so many denominations and the fracturing that's happened and all those divisions, what's happened? You know what's happened? People looked at the list and they started disagreeing with it. It says there's one body. Well, what if there were multiple? And suddenly another variant of church forms. It says that there's one baptism. Well, maybe that's not so important. And another variant of church forms. It says that there's one faith. Well, faith alone can save you. And suddenly another variant of church forms. And so you have many denominations today, which are unfortunately people who try and pursue God out of a good heart and good intentions, but they're missing elements of the truth. It's a call for us to be very serious in how we go about seeking the truth. How easy is it for us to look at these things and fudge on one or two of them and forget to align ourselves with God's truth first? Because that's where the unity comes from. Too many people want to pass on differences and want to make common ground based on human opinions, based on shared experiences, based on hobbies, or we generally enjoy God in the same way, and so let's just go with that. That is not the call of God. The call of God is to seek the truth and to know the truth and to find others who are doing the exact same thing. To be unified based not on human opinion or my personal feelings, but to be unified based on his standards. So you have to ask yourself, what is it that we unify around? Do you hold to God's standards or not? It's a pretty simple question, honestly. It's fine to have different interpretations of maybe why statements were made. It's fine to have different interpretations and take a passage in a slightly different way, but it would not be fine to contradict or to go against one of these basic core principles here. If you start saying there are multiple Holy Spirits, I'm sorry, I don't think we can come to an understanding on that. Because these things are the heart of the faith. And these things are our grounds on which we can be unified. In order to accomplish God's work, he gives us reasons to be unified with other people. Because the job is too big for one person alone. The job is too big for Paul. It's too big for Peter. It's too big for any of the apostles. It's too big for any preacher or elder or deacon or church member that you know. The job is to be unified with a bunch of people who are all doing all sorts of different things in their pursuit of God and working together and fulfilling different aspects of the body. Are we taking that seriously? Are we appreciating individual talents? Are we appreciating unique abilities and pulling those things together to use them? Are we actively pursuing unity? Or are we just taking it for granted that we're in a time of peace and so we don't need to seek out any of this work and we're all generally friendly, so it's fine? I don't know. But it feels to me that it would be very easy to mistake one for the other, and I hope we don't do that. What I do know is that God goes out of his way here to command unity in the church. And we may look at that and think it's an unimportant thing, and we can get it later. We can earn it later on and build it when the time comes. But Paul's first application Of all this teaching that he's done, of all this theory that he's given you, his first application is saying you need to use these things to get together and to form a foundation. Because any work that a church is going to do is based on this foundation. Because anything that the church is going to face is based on this foundation. And when the hard times come, we're going to need more than just we're nice to each other. When the difficulties start pressing in, you need a rock foundation and not one of sand. There's a call here. A call for all of us to take what we want and to shelve what we want and start going and genuinely helping the other people that are here. Get outside of yourself. Go serve somebody else. Go talk to somebody new. Go spend time with them and form that relationship based on the call of God. Putting in that effort while the times are easy is going to pay off when the times get hard, and the times will always get hard again. We don't know when, so we better be ready for it. God has called us to be together. God has given us everything, and based on everything that God's done, as you're examining the work of God, as you're examining the plan of God, as you look at the church that shows off his grandeur, as you look at all of our different roles that are to be played out to his glory, as you examine all of these things, don't you have a part to play in building it together too? So I would urge you to seek out the places you can be useful. I would urge you to seek out positions where you can serve. I would urge you to make the connections that you haven't made before. Even though it may have been many years, reach out to somebody else and start to pull together. It's the only way we can do something for God. It's the only way we can be of true service to the Lord. To unify here so that we can use that to help other people. So whether you're not with the group at all, whether you're just kind of floating on the outside and never have come to the faith in the beginning, or maybe you're a long-standing veteran, but you've been doing it alone for a long time, we need each other. God has called us to be with each other and to work together. So if there's anything we can do to enshrine the value of that work in you and to push you into serving God as part of the church, I beg you to do something about it. If there's any way I can help, you can come and talk to me. I'll be standing right here as we're all standing and singing this song.